Welcome to Module 12, which is titled The Presence of God in Your Life. We have been looking at the presence of God in the Old Testament, and in the previous module, the presence of God in the New Testament. Now I would like to turn to finding the presence of God in your life. The music during the introductory part of this module was that of the magnificent Johann Sebastian Bach, and perhaps you recognize the tune. It was Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring. And the image that you saw was the Church of the Jesu, the interior, the Church of the Jesu, literally the Church of Jesus. It's the principal church of the Jesuits in Rome. The Jesu is the church that every Jesuit looks to as his spiritual home, and although I'm not a Jesuit, it was my spiritual home as well for the 4 years that I studied in Rome. We'll go there to the Jesu if you go on the trip to Rome, but I hope you can start to see some things coming together. Jesu, the joy of man's desiring. The Church of the Jesu. The Church of the Jesuits, which was the order founded by St. Ignatius of Loyola. Desire, the desire for Christ, the desire for God. This experience of desire is how we can locate the presence of God in our life. And of all the many gifts that Ignatius of Loyola gave to the church, being able to locate the presence of God in our experience, especially through desire. This is, well, what I think is perhaps his greatest gift to the church. We're going to look to St. Ignatius of Loyola in this module. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, will be our guide in this module. And so I hope you can see a pattern forming. Jesus, joy, desire, Ignatius of Loyola, the Ignatian spirituality that he gave to the church. I love it when a module comes together. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Let's look at just a little background of St. Ignatius of Loyola to get started with this module. Let's learn a little bit about this great saint, this founder of the Jesuits, who will be our guide for Module 12. Ignatius of Loyola. Well, we started in Rome with the interior of the Church of the Jesu. That's where Ignatius ends his life. He dies in Rome. Let's start at the beginning. Let's go back to the place of his birth. And to do that, we need to go to northern Spain, to the Basque country, in the town of Loyola. Ignatius was born here in 1491 in the Basque region of northern Spain. We know exactly when he died. It was on July 31st, 1556, which is the feast day in the liturgical year for St. Ignatius, July 31st. So we know the exact date of his death, but we don't know for sure the date of his birth. But it was in the year 1491, the year before Columbus sailed for America. He was the youngest of 13 children, born into a very well-to-do family. He was baptized Inigo. The name Ignatius is going to be a Latin version of his name that he'll use later on in life. But when he's born, when he's christened, I should say, baptized, he was named Inigo. And Inigo, as he grew up, much like St. Augustine did 1,000 years earlier, well, Inigo led a rather wild life as a young man. He was addicted to gambling. He often engaged in duels. He loved swashbuckling. He thought of himself as a soldier of fortune. And he thought the good life was living the high life, attached to some noble court with all the luxuries and the ladies that court could provide a dashing young soldier of fortune. In 1504, the French army invaded his homeland while he was a colonel in the army, in the Spanish army, at Pamplona, Spain. And although Ignatius and his Spanish forces were hopelessly outnumbered, he urged his fellow Spanish soldiers to keep fighting for the glory of Spain. A cannonball shattered his leg, but the French were so impressed with his courage and valor that they actually carried Inigo back to his hometown of Loyola, rather than throw him into a prison, which is what they would have normally done with any prisoner of war. Clearly, Inigo impressed the French. Although they were his enemies, they were obviously impressed with this young man. If only his strong personality could be harnessed for God. Okay, that last comment was obviously such a leading one. Of course his strong personality will be harnessed by God. I mean, why else would we be talking about him today? Back to the event right after the cannonball shatters his leg and Inigo is taken home. It was during this time of recovery and convalescence that Inigo is going to make an amazing discovery. Now remember, he was a man of action. He thrilled to heroics of all sorts, especially on the battlefield. But here he was now, flat on his back, barely able to move, bedridden, and so of course he was bored out of his mind. He asked if there were any books to read in the castle. Now he wanted something like Sports Illustrated or some kind of action adventure magazine, I don't know, like Field and Stream, but there was nothing like that to read in the castle of Loyola. Instead, all they had were books on saints. Now at first Inigo was bored even with this kind of reading material, but he really had little choice, so he kept reading about the saints. And as he read, he soon began to wonder if he could do something like the saints did. He began to wonder if he could even outdo some of the great saints like Dominic and Francis. You see how competitive this young man was still at this point in his life. But something else began to happen to him, lying in that sickbed. He started to pay attention to his own experience and how he was relating to what he was reading. And he began to make some very interesting discoveries. At first, he admitted the idea of reading about the saints just bored him. But he decided to read about them anyway, and he noticed that after reading about them and after thinking about them, he was energized. His mood improved. His thoughts were elevated. He felt better afterwards. And he also noticed the contrary. At first, all those daydreams about military glory and heroics and fame and fortune, all that stuff that used to matter to him so much before his injury, all that stuff that used to seem so exciting and interesting to him, now he noticed that after thinking about those things, and after daydreaming about those sorts of things that at first seemed so exciting, well, in the end, those daydreams only left him feeling empty and saddened and spiritually depleted. This twofold insight led to what Ignatius is going to call consolation and desolation. Consolation and desolation. He noticed this fluctuated back and forth as he was lying there on that sickbed. Consolation and desolation. Sometimes he felt energized and uplifted by what he read and by what he thought about. Again, reading about the saints brought on feelings of consolation. Sometimes, though, thinking about things like honor and glory and battle and all of that, those things ended up just leaving him feeling depleted and empty, desolation. Again, he's going to term these two types of experiences consolation and desolation. Let me explain just a little bit more about what he discovered about these two things. Consolation. What did Ignatius mean by consolation? Well, you know those times when life just seems to be clicking on all cylinders. Everything is just falling into place. You're praying well. You feel close to God. Your family's doing well. All your bills are paid right when they come in. Life feels good. Life feels together. You feel strong. You feel secure. You're not bothered by temptations, or when those temptations show up, well, you can handle them. You can turn away from them easily because your prayer life is so rock solid. You just feel so close to God. You feel energized. You're not harried or run down. Instead, you feel strong and together, spiritually, physically, mentally. All of that together can be termed consolation. And when we have these moments of consolation in life, it's easy to overcome temptation. but especially when we have these consolations in prayer. You know, those moments when God just feels so close, when there's this calm that settles upon you, when you feel that warming of the heart, when there's this uplifting experience in prayer, when God is so close and prayer is so rich, oh, that, above all, is consolation. But those moments don't last, do they? I mean, they're wonderful when they come in prayer, but prayer isn't always like that. And life isn't always like that. Some weeks, everything is going the opposite direction. Desolation is the opposite kind of experience. We feel scattered. We feel run down. We feel like we're missing every deadline. We're never able to get caught up. We're just exhausted, running here and there, all over the place. There are problems in our families. There are problems at work. Nothing seems to be really clicking in life. And in prayer, when we try to turn to prayer, what happens? We might even go to the adoration chapel, and nothing is happening. We're bored. We're distracted. We keep looking at our watch. When is this holy hour going to be over? Time seems to drag. And God seems far away, frankly. We just feel completely on our own. We feel run down, depleted. This is desolation. In prayer, it's when we're just filled with distractions and we keep turning pages and we just don't feel close to God. Prayer is dry. God seems far away. And our minds then are just filled with all these distractions. That's desolation in prayer. And then, of course, in life, it's easy to see it when we're just run down, always behind the 8 ball, just trying to catch up and get everything covered that we have to be responsible for, and it just leaves us feeling empty, run down, exhausted, depleted. That's desolation. Okay, this is the key discovery that Inigo makes on his sickbed. He paid close attention, very close attention, to these movements in his soul, this back and forth between consolation and desolation. And he started to notice some things that would bring consolation on, some things that would bring desolation on. And he noticed, he paid very close attention to his experience, and he noticed some things to do during times of consolation, and likewise some strategies to help deal with desolation. And this is what he started to notice. He noticed some impulses came directly from God. Some impulses just felt so good and so right and so true that he knew those were from God. Some impulses, however, came from other places. Sometimes these impulses looked good at first, like all those thoughts about fame and glory and all of that. They looked good at first, but they ended up leaving him empty and desolate on the inside. How to discern what came from God, what was truly good, and what didn't come from God because it was only apparently good. It looked good at first, but it ended up only making things worse. This is what Ignatian spirituality is all about. You see, Inigo kept paying attention, close attention to his experience of God and how the presence of God was working in his life. And by paying close attention, not only did he notice these fluctuations, this back and forth, but he noticed what caused these experiences and some important things to do during these times of consolation and desolation. And he gathered all these insights together into a book called The Spiritual Exercises, which I'm only going to be able to introduce to you in this module. And in fact, I don't want you to read The Spiritual Exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola. This may be the only time I urge you not to read a book. You see, the spiritual exercises of Ignatius, they're not meant for you. They're meant for your spiritual director. If you read this book, you'll look at it and you'll wonder, what's the big deal? That's because the book isn't written for you. It's written for your spiritual director, who, armed with the insights that Ignatius gathers together in this book, he knows what to listen for. She knows what to keep an ear out or an ear open for. The spiritual director will listen to your experience, this movement between consolation and desolation, and your spiritual director will be able to help you using the spiritual exercises, but don't read them for yourself. They won't make much sense, and they'll leave you thinking, what's the big deal? Few books have had the impact that the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola has had upon the Western history of our church. This book is what fueled all those Jesuit missionaries and supported them on their journeys. It's the book that led to them opening all of their colleges and universities. It's the book that is the heart and soul of the Jesuit life. But don't try to read it. If you're really interested in Ignatian spirituality, make an Ignatian retreat. Go on retreat. Your spiritual director will be ready with this wisdom culled from St. Ignatius, but leave the book to your director. Don't try to read it on your own. Okay, so what causes consolation and desolation? What brings these experiences on? Let's start with the easy one first. Okay, God causes consolation. We do not. Consolation comes from God whenever God chooses to give them to us. Consolation happens when that calm, that peace, that warm presence arrives in prayer, that freedom from worry, when that freedom from distraction happens in prayer. That's that closeness that arrives in prayer, that's consolation. And I trust these moments when they arrive, especially when I'm thinking about something else, frankly. Sometimes I'm worried about what this next module is going to be about, and all these things I have to do, and it takes a while to settle into prayer, as you well know. And sometimes I'm thinking about something else, and this consoling presence shows up. I trust that comes from God, especially when I'm thinking about something else and when I'm not trying to make it happen. This is the key thing. Of course, when we experience these warm, rich consolations from God in prayer, we want them every single time. I mean, who wouldn't? And we go to prayer secretly hoping they'll show up, or maybe even not so secretly. Well, go to prayer expecting them, wanting them, every single time we sit down to pray, and then we're in charge. Then we're calling the shots, not God. And so it might be a simple thing to say that God brings on the consolation, but deep down we think we can make it happen, and we expect it to happen. And if it doesn't happen, well, then sometimes we're up and out of the door. So the important thing to realize when looking at consolation is they come from God, not from us, and we don't bring them on, and we can't expect them to come on, and we can't insist that they show up every single time in prayer. Okay, so God definitely brings consolation. That's pretty straightforward, I think. But there is something else that we can do. We can cooperate with the grace of God, which can help bring consolation. What do I mean by this? Well, you've made certain spiritual resolutions. I'm not going to gossip the next time I see somebody, or I am not going to let this problem get the better of me tomorrow. And when we cooperate with the grace of God and we actually pull it off, when we refrain from gossip, when we avoid whatever problem that we're struggling with, when we actually manage to do this with the help of God, with the grace of God, it feels wonderful. It's a spiritual victory. It should feel good. I mean, that's how we're getting stronger spiritually. And so our action can help bring on consolation when we try, with the grace of God, to live the Christian life. Now again, it's really important that the grace comes before, and it's the grace of God that brings the consolation. So again, don't fall into the trap that your own willpower is producing the consolation. But part of the Christian life and the joy of it is that when we live it and cooperate with the grace of God and overcome these temptations and grow in holiness, well then, yeah, that does feel wonderful. And that too is consolation. It's what St. Paul talks about when he says daily we are renewing the inner man, or the inner woman, if you will. As we do this, as we cooperate with the grace of God and effect this inner renewal, well then that too feels wonderful, and that too is consolation. Okay, again, that part is important. The main thing there is to not fall into the trap of thinking that we are doing it on our own, of course. But it gets a little more complicated than that. And it goes back to what Ignatius had to deal with when he thought things like glory and honor would be good when they ended up not being so good for him. What makes us fall for certain things that are not so good for us? What tempts us into thinking that something's going to be really wonderful, and it's going to make you happy, and it's going to bring a real thrill to your life, and yet it produces the opposite thing. It ends up making us feel worse. Ignatius calls this the angel of light. The angel of light. This is much more difficult for us to see, at least at first, because the angel of light deceives us into thinking something's going to be wonderful, it's going to be just so exciting and so much fun and so good for you personally, and we can fall for this. It will appear as something good and desirable for us, but it is not. We think, oh, if only I had this person in my life, or only if I had that job, or if only this would change, if only my spouse would do this differently, if only I had that opportunity, then my life would be great. Again, Ignatius on his sickbed thought, daydreams of fame and glory, things that he thought looked good. It was an angel of light that brought those to him. They looked good at first, but in the end, they only left him feeling empty and saddened. It's the same thing with us. Those things that look good at first, in the end, usually we learn the hard way, end up not being good for us. They looked good at first because of the angel of light, according to Ignatius. Test every spirit, St. Paul says. This advice, to discern the spirits, this biblical advice from St. Paul, it's the foundation of Ignatian spirituality. And so it's not quite so straightforward as it seems, this discernment of spirits. It's going to take a little bit more help from Ignatius, I think, for us to always see this clearly. And sometimes, again, we learn the hard way in life, and that's how we can learn what really is good for us and what only appears to be good for us. Perhaps you've heard me or somebody else say that St. Thomas Aquinas says we never choose evil directly. We always choose it under the guise or the appearance of good. It's the angel of light, according to Ignatius, that makes it look good to us. So yeah, something that's not good for us, we fall for this deception and we rationalize it. We come up with reasons, with excuses, why we need something, why we deserve it, why it would be so good for us when in time it only brings us desolation. A variation on this is what the Catholic tradition calls the noonday devil. Why the noonday devil? Well, sometimes it's so clear to us that we're being tempted. I mean, our imaginations are filled with things like lust or anger or jealousy or envy or the 7 deadly sins. They're pretty obvious. They're about as subtle as a sledgehammer. We know we're being tempted. Sometimes we know they're wrong. And fortunately, sometimes we do them anyway. But the noonday devil is a different kind of beast. He's subtle. He's not so dramatic. It's not so obvious as lust or anger or jealousy or all that. He's much more low-key, but that does not mean that he is not a real threat. He's called the noonday devil because at high noon there are no shadows, no obvious temptations, the darkness of heavy temptation. That's not the problem here. It's something else. And during the high noon, during the heat of the day, especially during the summer, what happens? We get listless. We get bored. Time seems to drag. We feel bogged down and we don't know exactly why, and we start to wonder why we're not happy anymore, why things aren't going very well. And then we try to figure out a way out of this problem, and we try to come up with something that we think will restore the happiness we once had. Oh, if only I was a Jesuit priest, instead of a diocesan priest. If only I could just devote my life to scholarship and to study and to reading and teaching, and wouldn't life be so much better than, being a diocesan priest in Wichita, Kansas? You can see a variation of the Noonday Devil's recent attempt with me. It's the same with all of us, though. The Noonday Devil tempts us into thinking, oh, if we just had something else, life would be so much better. If I just had a different spouse, someone who really appreciated me, someone who would really show affection and really take care of me, somebody who would be somebody that I deserved, then my life would be so much richer and I'd be so much happier. Maybe that's your version of the Noonday Devil. Oh, beware the Noonday Devil in whatever guise he takes, however he shows up. Especially be careful whenever it's a matter of boredom, whenever it's listlessness, whenever just by sheer inertia we just can't quite get to the prayer chapel, whenever we think, oh, there are all these other things I've got to do. I'm so much busier than somebody else who's always in the adoration chapel. I don't have time for that. I'll do that when I retire. That too is the Noonday Devil. The spiritual tradition has a name for all this, all of these tactics of the Noonday Devil. It's called acedia. Acedia is probably the thing that we have to be on guard against most. I mean, most of us aren't tempted to the really big capital sins. Usually we don't fall for that sort of stuff. But acedia and boredom and just low-level listlessness and just, oh, I just can't get around to praying today because that's acedia. You know, Google acedia, and there's an awful lot of really strong spiritual theology and great writing on this topic, all the way from John Cassian back in the 4th century to Kathleen Norris today. Acedia is a problem that we all have to conquer and overcome. We all have to face the Noonday Devil one way or another. Okay, we've looked at consolation, we've looked at the angel of light, we've looked at his companion, the Noonday Devil. Now just a little bit more on desolation. Does God ever bring on desolation? And yes, of course, he does. Now, sometimes we know where desolation comes from. I mean, when we sin, that opens the door to desolation. When we do something wrong and we feel guilty about it and we know it was wrong, that brings on a feeling of desolation, and that's a healthy thing in my opinion. I mean, it spurs us to go to confession and to make things right and to get back on track. So usually desolation is brought on by what we do when we make mistakes. And when we fail, and we do that one way or another, quite frequently, all of us, myself included, when we do that, that can bring on desolation. That seems pretty obvious, but God can also bring desolation. Why would God bring desolation to us? Well, think back to what I said earlier in this module. When we've had those warm experiences of consolation and prayer, and we love it, of course. And then we start to expect it every single time. Every time we go to the adoration chapel, we want it to be like that. And then we start having these expectations, and we're kind of in charge, and we want God to do this for us because we've done him the honor of showing up for this 1 hour of prayer. And then, of course, we're in the driver's seat, not God. So God will bring desolation as a test, and to wean us away from this expectation. If all you're doing is showing up in prayer to get something out of it, to get that consolation, to get that spiritual high, to get that uplift, well, pretty soon you're just praying because of what God can do for you. You're just turning to him for his consolations. You're not really turning to him. You're not loving God. You're loving the consolations. You're loving what he can do for you instead of loving him for himself. And so sometimes God will send us desolation. He will withhold consolation to see if we'll keep at it. Will we stay faithful when we're not getting anything out of it, when we're bored, when we're fighting these distractions, when our minds are just cluttered with all kinds of things on our to-do list? Can we hang in there even then? That's sometimes what God is up to when the desolations are there or when there's no consolation. He's trying to wean us away from this dependency on consolation and help our faith mature and help us grow closer to him. St. Ignatius has some very good advice. He said, on those times when you're praying, you've decided, I'm going to go do my holy hour. And you get there, and it's just all this thrashing around. Your mind's filled with distractions. Time is seeming to creeping. You keep looking at your watch. What Ignatius says during those kinds of prayer experiences, lengthen them. At about 5 minutes. At about 10 minutes. Don't let the boredom separate you from God in prayer. Add 5 or 10 minutes. If you stay a little longer, that desolation will lessen. If you stay a little longer, that boredom won't quite be so strong. If the boredom's coming from the enemy, if the enemy's trying to use boredom to separate you from God, just lengthen about 5 or 10 minutes, and that boredom will decrease. The next time you show up, that boredom won't be as strong. That kind of listlessness won't quite be so prevalent in your next prayer. Just add 5 or 10 minutes. And again, if it's coming from the enemy, that's one way to defeat him. Now, if the desolation is coming from God, that's not the strategy, obviously. God will not be defeated by us adding 5 or 10 minutes. That's not what I'm saying. And remember what happened with Mother Teresa. You know, the world was so surprised to learn of her desolation there for years, towards the end of her life. It was surprising, but not that surprising if you've done a little bit of reading in spiritual theology. The press, of course, missed it. They said, oh, see, she lost her faith, she was in anguish. That is not what was going on. She was experiencing desolation, to be sure, but that didn't mean she didn't have faith. Instead, her faith was so strong, her faith was so rock solid that she didn't need those consolations like we do, beginners that we are in prayer. We want those consolations, and when we don't get them, frankly, sometimes we get up and we go do something else, sad to say. Not Mother Teresa. She showed up in prayer day after day, year after year, even when there was no consolation, even when there was darkness, even when it was all desolation. Didn't mean she'd lost her faith. It meant that she had a faith that was just so strong that it wasn't fueled by this desire for consolation. Okay, I think the key insight here is don't let the boredom throw you. Don't let it separate you from God. Don't follow that impulse. The key insight from Ignatius is when we need to learn to discern and recognize the impulses that come from God and to always act upon those. And to try to carefully discern which of these impulses, they may look good at first, they may look justifiable at first, they may look urgent at first, but don't follow those if they are trying to separate you from God. Follow the impulses that come from God, resist, stand firm. Do not give in to those impulses that come from anywhere else. This is the key insight. And you know from your own prayer experience that if you go to prayer and it's just one of those where you're filled with distractions, nothing is happening, you're not getting anything out of it, all of a sudden that grocery list is just going to become so urgent. I've got to get up there and get to Dillon's now because, all of a sudden I've got to get something else done. See, that temptation will show up when there's no consolation. When the consolation's happening, it's easy to stay in prayer. When there's no consolation, we'll always find something so easily that just has to be done right now. That'll just be all of a sudden be so urgent. We'll go do something more need-satisfying if there's no consolation there. That's where we are at the beginning of our spiritual life. Ignatius says, don't fall for that. Resist the impulses that come from anywhere but God. Act upon the impulses that come from God. Stand firm against the others, and they'll weaken. They will grow less. They won't have quite the hold on you. Okay, I think that's a pretty good overview of consolation and desolation. What I'd like to do now is to show you a video clip from Father Bob Barron. And this one at first might be a bit of a head scratcher. You might think, why am I showing you this video clip? It's on the steroid scandal in baseball. Now, Father Barron's not going to use the word consolation or desolation in this video clip, but I think it's all about desolation. and what those baseball players gave into in order for them to start using steroids. So just watch this clip and I will clarify things after the video. Okay, here's the clip now.
I've been a baseball fan since I was a little kid. My father took my brother and me to a Detroit Tigers game back in the 1960s, and I still remember vividly that almost garishly green field under the white lights and the bright white uniforms of the players. And baseball just got in my mind from that night on. I became a player as a little guy. I was a T-ball player when I was 7. Then I moved all through Little League and Babe Ruth League, and I became actually a pretty good shortstop and hitter by the time I was in high school. In 1969, we moved to Chicago, and I became, God help me, a Cub fan in that very year when the Cubs collapsed. And so I learned a lot about hope and despair and all those things as a Cub fan. I've been a student of the great players over the years. So I've seen, Roberto Clemente play, and I've seen Ernie Banks and Pete Rose and Cal Ripken and Brooks Robinson and many of the great players. And I've always admired them and loved watching them. Well, in 1999, I was a professor at the seminary, and a student there was getting ordained out in Seattle. And he knew how much I love baseball. And he said, why don't we go to a Mariners game? And I wanted to go largely to see the great Alex Rodriguez. He was just kind of breaking into baseball. He was known as one of the finest players, and I wanted to see him play. And he didn't disappoint. That night he got, I think it was 3 hits. But what I remember most about A-Rod was his last at-bat was a strikeout. But it was the most beautiful strikeout I've ever seen because he swung at the last pitch. And if you appreciate the baseball swing, he had the most balanced, elegant, beautiful swing. And I can still see that in my mind, A-Rod swinging at the baseball. Well, anyway, I was thinking about all this when the revelations came out recently about Alex Rodriguez's steroid use. And I was really saddened by it because here's the great A-Rod, who's now joined these kind of sad ranks of a number of steroid abusers, from Ken Caminiti to Rafael Palmeiro to Mark McGwire and to Roger Clemens and, of course, Barry Bonds. So he's joined this kind of sad group. There's much, of course, you could say from a moral standpoint about the steroid abuse. You could say these players have cheated on their fellow players, they've abused their bodies, they've undermined the integrity of the game, and all of that. And all that is true, of course, obvious enough. Here's what struck me, though, as I read the stories about A-Rod, especially in tandem with Barry Bonds, probably now the 2 most famous steroid abusers. Barry Bonds and A-Rod began using steroids. So Bonds, I think, in 1998, A-Rod in 2001, when they were at the top of their games, when they were at the height of their powers. Barry Bonds began using steroids when he was already a 3-time MVP. A-Rod began using steroids when he was already the recipient of the biggest contract in sports history. Both were seen at that time as the 2 best players in the game. They could out-hit, outrun, outplay almost anybody on the field. They were guaranteed Hall of Famers. They had more money than they could spend in 10 lifetimes. Okay, here's what I find puzzling. Why did they feel obliged to use steroids? They weren't 250 hitters struggling to make it in the major leagues. They weren't minor leaguers hoping by this special means to get into the major leagues. These were the 2 best players in the game. These were at the height of their powers. It's been suggested that Barry Bonds began using steroids because he was jealous of the McGwire-Sosa home run race in '98, and he wanted to get involved. A-Rod has suggested he was trying to live up to the expectations of his great contract. Well, okay. As far as they go, that explains it a bit. But I think it goes much deeper than that. Go back to St. Augustine. The great Augustine talked about concupiscence or concupiscent desire. What he meant was this: an errant or fallen desire. Augustine knew, and it's one of the marks of his genius, Augustine knew that we are wired for God. Lord, you've made us for yourself, and therefore our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. We're wired for God. Therefore, if we take that deep desire for God and we hook it onto anything other than God, we become almost inevitably addicted. See, and here's why. The desire for God is infinite. You hook it on to money or success or power or fame or anything in this world, nothing in this world will satisfy it. Nothing in this world can satisfy it. And therefore, what do? Therefore, you go back obsessively to these wells. You go back to wealth again and again and again. I need more and more and more of it. You go back to power. You go back to honor. I need more and more and more of it. What Augustine called concupiscence, we probably today would call addiction and the addictive pattern. That's what I see in Barry Bonds, I see in A-Rod, is these two figures at the height of their powers, nevertheless felt obliged to go back and back and back, to press it, press it, press it. What's the solution? And here our great spiritual tradition is unanimous. The solution is detachment, is to realize that my deepest desire, the desire of my heart, is ordered to God and to God alone. And therefore, even as I appreciate the things of the world, we're not Puritans. We're not Puritans. We appreciate the things of the world, but we know they're not God. And therefore, we adopt a stance of detachment vis-a-vis these things. See, here's the thing. Here's the hinge. Barry Bonds and A-Rod were not addicted to steroids per se. They were addicted to success. And we know this because at the height of their success, they still wanted more. One of the most liberating and salutary things we can know is this: we are not meant to be perfectly happy in this life. When we convince ourselves otherwise, we necessarily fall into one or more patterns of addiction. Bonds and Rodriguez, at the height of their powers, still felt this nagging sense of incompleteness. But that was not an invitation to take desperate measures. That was the invasion of grace.
Okay, here is what I think was going on in the minds of those baseball players that decided to use steroids. They gave in to those desolating thoughts and those desolating impulses. Some little thought was flitting through their mind, and it might have been some variation of, well, everybody else is doing it, you're not going to be able to compete if you don't, or you've worked hard, you deserve this. You know, you're at the peak of your abilities. Don't waste the next couple years of your career. Use something that will make you the best you can be, that will just enhance your abilities. There could be lots of variations on that, you know. You deserve this. Everybody else is doing it. You can't compete without it. I mean, again, images of fame and glory and prestige, we saw those operating in the young Ignatius. I think they were operating in the minds of those guys that gave in to the impulse to, go on these steroids. Sad to say, because it's obviously tarnished the game. An angel of light showed up in their minds, I think, with these impulses, with these little thoughts creeping through their mind, rationalizing why they needed to do something like take these artificial chemicals to enhance their abilities as athletes. There are lots of ways. The enemy tempts us. Not just baseball players are subject to the angel of light, of course. These kinds of thoughts, these kinds of rationalizations, these kinds of impulses, they badger all of us. Ignatius' advice is recognize them, unmask them, discern them, and once you see what's going on, don't give in to any impulse, even if it looks good, even if we can come up with all these reasons for it. Don't give in to it. Don't follow those thoughts and impulses, and they will lessen in your life. If you give in to them, they only get stronger. And they bring real desolation the more they accumulate in our lives. Ignatius also has this spiritual advice. During times of desolation, don't make a new decision. Now, it can be as simple as you're in the adoration chapel and prayer's not going very well, at least the way you want it to, and you're bored, and so it's like, oh, I'm just going to cut this 30 minutes short today. That's a pretty, simple example. Ignatius says, don't give in to desolation no matter what. If you give in to the desolation, it only makes it worse. So the next time you show up, the devil will come back with that temptation, and that boredom will come back, and he'll try to get you to leave even 10 minutes earlier. Or maybe it's in your marriage. Things aren't going very well. And so desolation has settled in your soul. And you think, oh, only I had a new spouse. If only I had somebody in my life who appreciated me. I'm just, I put up with this long enough. I'm going to get rid of this person and I'll find somebody that's really, attractive and is really going to just appreciate me for the person that I am. You see how desolation works. When we're in the midst of desolation, we all want to get out of it. And we think that if we just come up with the right fix, that those feelings will subside, but they don't. If we give in to the desolation, it only makes it worse by changing course in the midst of desolation. Ignatius says, don't. Hold firm, stand fast, keep to whatever resolution you made. If you said you're going to stay for an hour in this prayer period, you stay an hour. You even add 5 minutes if you need to. Or if you made vows to be married, you stay married. Now, I know it's a lot more complicated, the example on marriage. Two people are involved here, and sometimes you obviously have no control over any other person. But I think you can see the point I'm trying to make. During times of desolation, over the things that we can control, don't make a change. Don't do anything different in desolation. Really hang tough and hang on to those resolutions that you made before the desolation arrived, and it will lift sooner. And those times of consolation will come back. Okay, that's what to do during times of desolation. What to do during times of consolation. Ignatius is great here. He says, relish it, enjoy it, revel in it. Just don't say, oh, I'm not worthy, or God, I'm not good enough for this. Ignatius says, don't do that. Relish it and just revel in it and enjoy it and store up memories of it, because it's not going to last. Now, desolation doesn't last all the time either, but neither does consolation. So the thing to do during consolation is just store up these memories of enjoyment and relish these experiences of God in prayer, so that when the desolation does come back, we're armed and we're ready for it. And we can fall back on those memories and say, oh, I remember it was like that before. It'll be like that again. It can be like that again. You just have to ride out this desolation and hold fast to my resolutions and trust that it's going to come to an end. Okay, the best antidote to desolation, Ignatius says, is gratitude. Gratitude is the thing to store up, perhaps more than anything else. Gratitude is the surest way out of any kind of desolation. Gratitude is the surest way into an awareness of the presence of God. Here's how Ignatius went about trying to help his young Jesuits develop their sense of gratitude. Here's what he urged them to do as a way of using gratitude in prayer. He called it the examen. Jesuits do this every day, sometimes twice a day, but it's called the examen. It takes about 10, 15, 20 minutes max. Ignatius said to his Jesuits, you can miss the office if you need to. You could even miss daily mass if you really had to, but never, ever miss doing the examen. It's that important, he said, for the spiritual life. Okay, so if it's that important, just what is this examen that Ignatius came up with? Well, again, the examen takes about 10, 15 minutes. Maybe do it at the end of your day and just look back over your day. And then the next day when you do the examen, you would look back over your day to the previous time you did the examen. So if you do the examen every day, you just look back over your day between those prayer periods that Ignatius calls the examen. There are 5 steps to it. At first it might seem a little forced, a little artificial, like, what was step 3 again? I can't remember. Yeah, everybody starts that way. It'll soon become quite natural and it'll be a seamless prayer experience, because one step does lead into the other once you have the steps down. Step 1 is gratitude. Look back over your day and look for the specific things to be grateful for. Gratitude for the ways that you can really see God working throughout your day. Gratitude for specific things that God helped you with. The people that just were so important to you in that day. The people you met, how you interacted with them. The problems that turned out all right. gratitude for the kindness of others, gratitude for all the ways you could sense God was helping you throughout your day. The important thing here is to be very specific, not just, I'm grateful for everybody in my family. Okay, grateful for your spouse when he or she did this. Grateful for when your teenager did this, that, or whatever it may be. Get really specific. Could be as simple as I came home from Newman the other day and one of the sisters had this big box of cookies out at my door. I mean, again, a really specific awareness of gratitude for those specific situations. Step 2. With this 5 minutes of gratitude under your belt, step 2 is look for any impulses of desolation that came into your day. When did you feel angry? Did you wake up muttering about some comment someone made about your kid in school yesterday, or some comment made by somebody else at work? Any impulses to become possessive or jealous or upset or angry or resentful? Were you bored? Again, boredom is a huge spiritual drag to be on guard against. Were you restless in prayer? Were you distracted? Were you bogged down with worry? Now here's a key thing to keep in mind about step 2. Step 2 is not a list of, well, I told 3 lies and I got into an argument with my spouse and I flipped somebody off in traffic. I mean, step 2 is not that. It's not making a list of faults. I mean, most people who do that, we soon tire of that. It just makes us kind of feel down on ourselves, and we soon give up that kind of practice. That's not what Ignatius is saying. He's saying, this isn't an examination of conscience where you list things. It's an examination of consciousness, which is something different. Instead of listing your faults, try to identify those impulses that showed up right before you committed that lie. There probably was some little thought, some little feeling, some little impulse that showed up that led you to commit the lie. Try to identify that little desolating thought or feeling. Try to sense it. Most likely under the surface, there was something there. Underneath all the busyness of life, it's easy to miss this, but try to identify that impulse in your experience. The reason for doing this is so that the next time this little impulse shows up, you'll catch it sooner. You'll recognize it. You'll see that it's not from God. And once you recognize where this impulse is coming from, you'll be much more likely to stand firm against it and to reject it. And the more we stand firm against those negative impulses, those little daily desolations, the stronger we get. The holier we become. The more we grow in our faith. And the more we recognize these darting little impulses, these little desolations that badger us every day, the more we'll be free of them. And let me tell you, nothing feels better in the spiritual life than to be free from worry, free from all these things that pull us down. The more we grow in freedom, the more we grow in happiness and holiness. Here's another example of what I mean. We all know gossip isn't good, and we've made resolutions to not do it, and the next time we run into Sally Sue or whatever, we're not going to do that sort of thing. And yet we bump into Sally Sue and we start talking about somebody who's not very popular, or somebody who's difficult, or somebody who's problematic. And all of a sudden, some dark, sour little impulse or thought is going to show up under the surface of your conversation. There's going to be some little niggling, sour little attitude, impulse, thought that's going to show up under the surface. And it's going to be fun to give in to this, to start talking about somebody else. It'll bring you and Sally Sue closer together. You'll have something in common, something to talk about, and it'll bring you closer together in this conversation with the two of you aligned against somebody else. And it's all true what you're saying, you know. So, I mean, you can say it if it's true. I mean, we rationalize like that. Even if it's true, you know, if we give in to the gossip, we've fallen back into that little desolating negativity, and it builds up in our soul. And the more this negative stuff builds up, well, then the more the desolation comes on. If you stand fast, if you can recognize it first and stand fast against that little that little dark, sour impulse that first shows up, oh my goodness, it's going to feel so much better. You will feel so much better about yourself. You will grow spiritually stronger, and you'll be able to start to catch these little impulses when they show up in your day sooner. Your spiritual reflexes will get quicker, and you'll be able to recognize these things and hold them off. And the more you grow and act upon the good impulses and stand firm against the bad impulses, well, just the better you become as a person and the stronger you get in your spiritual life. George Eschenbrenner calls the examine of consciousness, not the examination of conscience. And see, again, the difference. If it's just a list of faults, well, we don't like doing that. However, if it's an awareness of what's going on in your experience, and then seeing that and identifying that, you actually grow out of it, and you grow better, and you get stronger. Everybody responds to that. Everybody wants to get better. And this is a really concrete way to do that. And so getting better brings on hope. I mean, the desolation doesn't have to just bog us down in it. We don't have to walk around under that. And we can get out from underneath it. And once we do that, that brings on hope. I mean, this is why also gratitude is so important at the beginning of the examen. We store up all this gratitude so that it doesn't turn into I'm such a wretched sinner, and I told 3 lies today, and I can't believe I said what I did to my spouse. I'm just bad to the bone. I mean, gratitude helps us from going there. And it'll keep us from indulging in that kind of unhealthy, self-centered preoccupation. So step 1 is gratitude. Step 2 is trying to identify those little desolating moments. Step 3 is ask the Holy Spirit to take you deeper, to see even more clearly those little moments. Sometimes they'll be really obvious. I mean, if we had some big blow up with our spouse, that really bothers us. And so, yeah, that's obvious. And sometimes we stop, though, there, and we don't go deeper, and we don't see further. So step 3 is ask the Holy Spirit to let you go deeper and to see more clearly all the darting little impulses that dance around your soul and through your mind and in your heart throughout the day. And you'll be surprised at what comes up. Things that you never noticed will surface, and you'll go, oh yeah, that's why I ended up saying or doing what I did. I can see what was kind of tugging at my heart and my soul right before that. I can see now more clearly that desolating impulse when it first showed up, and now I'm not going to be fooled the next time. I'm going to be ready the next time. I'm going to be prepared the next time. And you will be, so that the next time it does show up, you'll be able to catch it more quickly and to stand guard against it and not let it shape you. So step 3 is going even deeper. Step 4 is a resolution not to do whatever we did today, not to give in to those impulses tomorrow, to resolve to try again, to resolve to be stronger tomorrow, to not give in to whatever we gave into today. Tomorrow is going to be another opportunity, another day of grace, another chance. And if those same little impulses come back, we're going to resolve not to give in to them and to avoid following them and not give in to that gossip if we see Sally Sue. We'll notice that little impulse when she shows up, and we're not going to go there. And we're going to have tomorrow be a better day than today was. And that will help a person grow in holiness as well. And not just holiness, but it brings hope that there is a way forward. There's a real, concrete, specific way to grow in holiness and to cooperate with the grace of God. And the more we do this, the more hopeful we become, and that leads to yet more gratitude, which is step 5. So step 5 is to be grateful for all the progress, all the advances, all the development, all the growth that comes through this resolution. Okay, we might fail tomorrow. We just might. We don't want to, but we might end up doing that. But, God can take care of that as well. The thing, however, in the examine is I'm going to resolve to try to do better, and I am going to trust that God will help me do that, and I'm going to be grateful for when that does occur, and that will help support me throughout the next day until I can make the examen once again. Doing this day after day after day, there's real progress that can come very quickly in the spiritual life, and we can very quickly be freed from the desolation that bogs us down and that afflicts every single one of us. Okay, doing the examen day after day, being faithful to it, it's going to help us see what Ignatius meant with a very key spiritual maxim that he always kept repeating to his Jesuits: find God in all things. Finding God in all things. Normally we look for God in church. We find God at Mass, hopefully, often. We find God inside a church. He's there, of course. But can we find God in everything? Can we find God throughout the day? Can we find God in the people we interact with? Can we find God in the good things that happen, the things that we're grateful for? That's not too hard. Can we find God even when things don't go well, when the problems do build up? Can we find God there? Can we find God when those dark little impulses show up and we resist those and we stand firm against those? There's the grace of God operating, to be sure. If we can find God even during the times of desolation, even in the times of boredom, if we can recognize the presence of God there, if we can recognize the help that comes to us then, if we can start to see God all throughout the day, in every circumstance, in every situation, now we're Jesuits at heart. Now we're really, the spiritual life is very, very rich if we're able to find God in all things. I hope you especially enjoyed this presentation on Ignatian spirituality. It's one school of thought. It's one approach to the spiritual life. There are others. The Catholic Church has many other ways of praying, and there are other schools of prayer. And so this certainly isn't the only one. But there are many resources on the web to help you if you'd like to learn more about Ignatian spirituality. It's very concrete. That's what I love about it. And it's tied to your experience. And this is where Ignatius says, above all, you will find the presence of God in your life, in your experience, in the experiences throughout the day, and the consolation and desolation, in this oscillation back and forth between consolation and desolation. This is God speaking to you, moving in your life, moving in your heart, through the desires that surface throughout our day, be they consoling or desolating. The way we interact between these two experiences will be one way for us to have a keen insight into the presence of God in our life. If you'd like to read more, there are lots of resources on the web. This brings Module 12 to a close. There's a reading assignment listed for you on the course syllabus and a threaded discussion question waiting for you in your study group. Thank you for your attention on this module. Till the next one, goodbye and God bless.